There's a specific kind of silence that lives inside a fire station at 4 in the morning, and I want you to sit with that for a second, because it's the last ordinary thing I remember before my entire life came apart. My name is Michael Venus. I'm 39 years old, and I've spent the last 14 years as a firefighter here in Astoria, Oregon, a fishing and logging town of about 10,000 people tucked right where the Columbia River meets the Pacific, underneath a green steel bridge that stretches 4 miles across the water into Washington State. I made captain 3 years ago at Station 2, over on Marine Drive, a firehouse with a view of the docks that I used to think was the best office window in the state of Oregon. I want to take a minute before I tell you about the worst night of my life, because I think you need to understand what I actually lost, not just the fact that I lost it. I met my wife, Rachel, at a house party in Portland almost 16 years ago, back when I was still working my first year at a station in North Portland and she was finishing her nursing degree at OHSU. She spent the first 20 minutes of that party arguing with me about whether the Trailblazers had any business trading away a decent power forward, and I spent the rest of the night trying to figure out how to keep the argument going without her noticing that I'd stopped caring about basketball entirely and started caring about her laugh instead. We got married 4 years later at a little vineyard out in the Willamette Valley, and when the department posted an opening for a firefighter position out here in Astoria, Rachel was the one who pushed for it, because she said she'd always wanted to raise a kid somewhere you could smell the ocean from the porch. Hannah came along 2 years after we moved out here. She had Rachel's stubborn chin and my absolutely terrible sense of direction, and by the time she was 4, she'd developed this habit of drawing little yellow suns on absolutely everything. School folders, birthday cards, the fogged-up windows of my truck in the mornings, because she told me, with the kind of total seriousness only a 4-year-old can manage, that the town got too much rain and somebody needed to keep track of the sun for whenever it decided to come back. Rachel worked as a labor and delivery nurse at Columbia Memorial Hospital, the kind of person who came home after a 16-hour shift delivering somebody else's baby and still had enough left in her to read our own daughter 3 books instead of 2. Because Hannah always asked for the 3rd one and Rachel could never quite bring herself to say no. I used to tease her about it. She used to tell me that someday, when Hannah was grown and gone, I'd understand exactly why she never said no, and I used to laugh and tell her that day was so far off it wasn't worth worrying about. I did not know it yet, 6 years ago, holding my daughter for the first time in a delivery room 2 floors up from where her own mother worked, that I had somewhere around 6 years left with both of them, and that no part of me would ever get a single day of warning about when that number would run out. The 2nd Wednesday of June was an ordinary day, right up until it wasn't. I left for a 24-hour shift at 6 that morning, the way I did every 3rd day, and Rachel stood in the driveway in her robe with a coffee mug in one hand and Hannah on her hip, and Hannah waved at me the way she always did, both arms over her head, like she was flagging down a plane. I remember thinking, backing out of the driveway, that it had been a good stretch lately. Rachel's schedule had finally eased up. Hannah had just lost her first tooth and would not stop showing anyone who'd look, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, our whole small life felt like it was running smooth. The shift itself was quiet. A couple of medical calls, a minor kitchen fire down on Commercial Street that we had out in 15 minutes. The kind of night that lets a fire crew actually sit down and eat dinner together instead of eating it cold out of a to-go box at 11 at night. I called Rachel around 9 to say goodnight, and she told me Hannah had insisted on wearing her rain boots to bed because she'd decided they were part of her pajamas now, and we both laughed about it. And that was the last conversation I ever had with my wife. Around 1:40 in the morning, our dispatch radio came alive with a structure fire call. I recognized the address before the dispatcher even finished reading it out loud, because I'd painted that mailbox myself the summer before, standing in my own driveway in the rain with Hannah helping, by putting her own small handprints in yellow paint along the bottom edge. I don't remember most of the drive over. I remember engine 2 pulling into my own front yard and seeing flames already coming through the living room windows, orange light thrown up against a house I'd lived in for 4 years, and I remember my own crew, men I had trained myself, men who trusted me to keep my head on straight on every single call we'd ever run together, physically holding me back from going through that front door. Because department regulation says a firefighter with a personal connection to a scene does not enter that scene under any circumstances. Full stop, no exceptions. A rule I had drilled into every single one of them myself, more times than I could count, and in that moment I hated every one of them for actually following it. Fire investigators would later determine the cause was a faulty electrical outlet behind our living room entertainment center, old wiring in a house built in the 1970s that had likely been failing slowly for months, sparking sometime after midnight and filling the house with smoke long before the flames themselves ever reached a point where anyone outside would have smelled or seen it. Rachel and Hannah never woke up. The coroner told me, in the gentlest voice a stranger has ever used with me in my entire life, that the smoke would have taken them in their sleep, quietly, well before the fire itself got anywhere close to their bedroom. I have held on to that single detail the way you hold on to a life preserver in cold water. It is the only mercy I got out of that entire night, and on some days, it's the only thing that gets me through the next one. I did not know it yet. Standing in my own front yard in full turnout gear, watching my own house burn while two of my own men held my arms, but the hardest part of that year wasn't going to be the fire itself. It was going to be my own parents. Welcome back to Sweet Family Revenge. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. You're going to love it here. My parents, Gerald and Linda Venus, live about 40 minutes south of me in Seaside, Oregon. My younger brother Kevin, 35, runs a marine repair shop down on the Astoria waterfront called Venus Marine Repair, a business our father helped him start 8 years ago with a loan against our parents' own house. Kevin's wife Amber handles the books for the shop, when she isn't handling most of the family's opinions for everyone else too. The kind of woman who can make "I'm just being honest" sound like a job title. I called my mother myself, standing outside the hospital morgue at 4 in the morning, still in half my gear, my hands shaking so badly I dropped the phone twice before I managed to get the words out. Her first question, once I finally told her, was whether the funeral could happen the following week instead of that weekend. I remember standing in that hospital hallway thinking I had somehow misheard her, the way your mind does that thing where it simply refuses new information for a second because the information doesn't fit anywhere reasonable inside your skull. "We've got the Alaska cruise, Michael," she said. "It's been paid for since February, 11 days, out of Seattle, with your brother and the kids. The deposits aren't refundable." "Mom," I said, "Rachel and Hannah are dead." "I understand that," she said, in the exact tone she'd use if I'd told her a package was running a day late. "I'm just saying, if we could move the service a week, that would help everyone's schedule." Everyone's schedule. I hung up the phone and sat down right there on the hospital hallway floor. And a hospital chaplain who'd been sitting quietly with me the entire night put a hand on my shoulder and didn't say a single word, because I think he understood there wasn't anything worth saying yet that could compete with what I'd just heard. The family group text picked up right where the phone call left off. My father sent one line, "So sorry, son, terrible thing," and then went quiet the way he always does the moment a conversation gets somewhere he doesn't want to stand. Kevin sent a crying emoji and nothing else. No words at all. It was Amber who wrote the message I will remember for the rest of my natural life, typed out in full, right there in the family thread for everyone, including me, to read. Of course everyone is devastated, but the tickets are non-refundable and the kids have been looking forward to this for months. I don't think Michael would want us to cancel a family vacation over what is, in the end, a trivial event. We'll pay our respects when we're back. A trivial event. I read that sentence 4 times, standing in a hospital parking garage at 5 in the morning, and each time I read it, some small remaining piece of faith I still had in my own family quietly finished dying alongside the 2 people I'd just lost. My mother's reply came 2 minutes later. A thumbs-up emoji, and the single word "agreed." Not one of them asked how the fire started. Not one of them asked for Hannah's middle name for the obituary, or whether I had anywhere to sleep that night. Since my house was now a blackened shell on Alameda Avenue, with a fire marshal's tape strung across the driveway, they asked which week worked better for their travel schedule. That was the whole of it. I told them the service would be held that Saturday, 4 days out, with or without them. Then I put my phone in my jacket pocket and did not look at it again for the rest of that day. I did not know it yet, sitting in that parking garage with the whole world tilted sideways underneath me, but that phone call was the last real conversation I would have with my parents for the better part of a year, and that the version of them I'd believed in my whole life had just quietly stepped off a cruise ship dock in Seattle and never come back. The front pew at Grace Community Church is reserved, by long custom, for immediate family. At Rachel and Hannah's service that Saturday, it stayed completely empty, and I made the choice, standing at the front of that church in a dress uniform instead of turnout gear for the first time in longer than I could remember, to have the ushers leave it exactly that way, rather than fill it with people who hadn't earned the seat. I sat in the second row instead, between my Uncle Carl, my father's older brother, a retired firefighter himself, 31 years with the Portland Fire Bureau, a man who drove 3 hours up from Portland the moment he heard, and Rachel's closest friend from the hospital, a nurse named Vivian Ross, who'd driven up from Portland herself that same morning. Still smelling faintly of the hospital because she'd come straight off a night shift rather than lose an hour finding something to change into. The church filled up entirely, standing room only along the back wall by the time the service started. My whole crew from Station 2 came in their dress blues, every single one of them, including 2 guys who were technically off duty for a family event of their own that they'd rearranged. A dozen nurses from Rachel's floor at Columbia Memorial came on their day off, several of them still in scrubs because they'd come straight from a shift rather than miss it. Hannah's entire kindergarten class showed up with her teacher, a woman named Miss Patterson, who stood up during the service, uninvited, tears running down her face, and told the whole room that Hannah was the only 6-year-old she'd ever taught who drew suns on rainy days because somebody had to remember it was still up there, even when you couldn't see it. My parents were somewhere off the coast of Ketchikan, Alaska on a cruise ship. My brother and his family were with them. Their seats stayed empty and clean while more than 200 people packed into a small-town church to say goodbye to a nurse and a little girl who colored sunshine onto everything she touched. I gave the eulogy myself. I didn't trust my voice to anybody else's hands, and looking back now, I'm glad I didn't, because it was the last thing I would ever get to say about them in front of the people who'd actually known them. I told the room that Rachel could read a room of terrified new parents at 2 in the morning better than anyone I'd ever met in my life. That she'd talked more than one father through the worst panic attack of his life, while still finding time to check on the woman in the next room over. I told them Hannah drew sons instead of princesses, because she'd decided, at 6 years old, that the weather in this town needed somebody keeping an eye on it, and that she'd once informed me, very seriously, that rain boots counted as pajamas if you believed hard enough. I did not mention the empty front pew. I didn't need to. Every single person in that church could see exactly what wasn't sitting in it, and I watched more than one face in that crowd turn toward it during the service, then look away. Uncle Carl walked me to my truck afterward and said the only honest thing anyone in my family offered me that whole week. "Michael," he said, standing there in the church parking lot with his hand on my shoulder, "they're not going to change. You should build your life around that being true, instead of waiting around for it to stop being true. I've watched your father do this exact thing to other people for 40 years. You're not the first. I'm sorry you had to be the worst version of it." 5 days after I buried my wife and daughter, my mother called me from the Seattle airport on her way home from that cruise, and I answered out of pure exhaustion, mostly because I'd stopped having the energy left to screen calls. There was no hello. No "how are you holding up?" There was airport announcement noise in the background and my mother's voice going straight into business, the exact tone she used to use calling about a late utility bill. "Michael, we need to talk about the $40,000, she said. I was sitting on the edge of my uncle's guest bed, where I'd been staying since the fire because there wasn't anywhere else. And I asked her, genuinely confused for a second, what $40,000 she meant. The down payment money, she said, like I should already know exactly what she was referring to. "Your father and I gave you and Rachel $40,000 4 years ago for the house. We need it back. Kevin's shop is in real trouble, Michael. The whole family needs to pull together right now." And that starts with everyone doing their part. I sat there holding the phone, genuinely unable to speak for a few seconds, trying to reconcile the sentence I'd just heard with the fact that my wife and daughter had been in the ground for exactly 5 days. "That was a gift," I said. "You and Dad told us it was a gift when you gave it to us. We used it for the down payment on the house that just burned down. Mom, the house is gone. There's nothing left of it. The insurance will be paying out on the house," she said. "You'll have money coming. We just need it sooner rather than later given Kevin's situation." I did not know it yet, sitting on my uncle's guest bed with a phone in my hand and my wife and daughter 5 days in the ground, that this single phone call was only the opening move in something that was going to escalate steadily for another 3 months before it finally came to a head in front of 40 of my own family members on a dock in Astoria. The calls kept coming through June and into July, always about the money, never once about Rachel or Hannah. My father called twice that first week to check in, and both times steered the conversation toward the $40,000 within the first 5 minutes, always in that same reasonable, business-like tone, as though he were discussing an overdue invoice, rather than a debt he'd invented out of thin air 5 days after his own granddaughter's funeral. In the 3rd week of June, Kevin called me directly for the first time since the fire, and he sounded genuinely rattled, not performing the way our parents did. "Michael," he said, "I know the timing is unbelievably bad, and I told them that. I want you to know I told them that. But the shop took a real hit this spring. We had a storm come through in April that flooded half our equipment inventory, and I'm underwater on the business loan Dad co-signed. If I go under, he's on the hook for it too. He's scared, Michael. That's why he's pushing so hard. I lost my whole family, Kevin," I told him. "I don't have anything left to build with. I'm living in Uncle Carl's guest room. I don't even have a house." "I know," he said, and his voice actually cracked a little on that word. "I know, man. I'm sorry. It's bad, Michael. It's really bad on my end, too." I believed him, honestly. I think that's the part of this whole thing that made everything harder to carry, not easier. Kevin's fear was real. What wasn't real was any acknowledgement, from any of them, of what I had actually lost. Not once in those first 3 weeks did my mother, my father, or my brother say Rachel's name or Hannah's name to me unprompted, in any conversation, for any reason. Not once did they ask what the fire investigator had found, or whether I was sleeping, or whether I had somewhere permanent to live. They asked about the money. Every single time, the conversation found its way back there within minutes. The way water finds the same low spot in a yard no matter how many times you try to fill it in. In the 2nd week of July, my mother and father drove up unannounced to Uncle Carl's house, where I was still staying while I dealt with the insurance adjuster, and started looking at what rebuilding on the Alameda Avenue lot might actually cost. Carl let them in because he said later he didn't think it was his place to turn his own brother away from the door, though I could tell from his face he regretted it within the first 5 minutes. They sat at Carl's kitchen table, and my mother slid a folded piece of paper across to me, a printout of the original wire transfer from 4 years earlier, $40,000. The date circled in red pen. "We just want something in writing," she said. "A payment plan, even a small one to start. It doesn't have to be all at once." "Mom," I said, "there's already something in writing. The gift letter you and Dad signed at the title company when Rachel and I closed on the house. It says, in your own handwriting, that this was a gift. No repayment expected, in any form. That's what the mortgage company required before they'd approve the loan." My father shifted in his chair. "That was a formality for the bank," he said. "It was never meant to actually mean anything between family." I sat there and looked at both of them, my mother and father, sitting at my uncle's kitchen table 5 weeks after my wife and daughter's funeral, telling me that a legal document they had signed themselves was never meant to actually mean anything. I didn't argue with them that day. I didn't have it in me. I told them I needed time to think, and I walked them out to their car, and Carl stood in his own doorway afterward and told me, quietly, that he'd never in his life been more ashamed of his own brother. By the end of July, I'd started attending a grief support group that met Tuesday evenings at the community center on Exchange Street, mostly at Vivian's suggestion, And it was there, sitting in a circle of folding chairs with 6 other people carrying their own version of an impossible year, that I said out loud for the first time what my family had actually done, and heard, out loud, from strangers, how insane it sounded when it wasn't just running around inside my own head. They asked you for money 5 days after the funeral. One woman in the group repeated back to me, slowly, like she wanted to make sure she'd heard it right. Before they asked if you were okay? They never asked if I was okay, I told her. Not once, not that call, not any call since. Saying it out loud in that room, to people who had no reason to defend my family and no stake in pretending it made sense, was the first time I actually let myself feel the full shape of what had happened, instead of just surviving it one exhausting phone call at a time. By the middle of August, Kevin's shop was set to hold a reopening event on Labor Day weekend. After months of repairs to the storm-damaged equipment and a fresh coat of paint on the building down on the waterfront, and my mother called to tell me the whole family would be there, and that it would mean a lot if I came. I did not know it yet. Driving down to that waterfront on Labor Day weekend with 2 folded sheets of paper in my jacket pocket. But I was about to give my family the only thing I had left to give them. The truth, laid out flat on a table, whether they wanted to see it or not. Venus Marine Repair sits on a stretch of the Astoria waterfront, with a clean view straight across the Columbia River toward the Washington side, boats tied up along the docks behind it, gulls working the pilings the way they always do in this town no matter the season. Kevin had strung up string lights for the reopening, and there were maybe 40 people there when I arrived. Extended family, a handful of Kevin's customers, and 2 guys from my own crew who'd come out of loyalty to me rather than any particular love for Kevin's business. My father stood up on an overturned equipment crate near the shop's front counter about 20 minutes into the event and gave a short speech about family sticking together through hard times, about how the shop had survived a rough spring because everyone had pulled in the same direction. Then he turned, slow and deliberate, and looked straight at me across the crowd. Some of us, he said, have been blessed and have maybe forgotten where that blessing came from. We helped Michael and Rachel when they had nothing. $40,000, and now that things are settled for him, he won't lift a finger to help his own brother. A murmur went through the crowd. Amber, right on cue, added her own line, sweet and sharp at the same time. The way she always delivers the worst things she says. It's a shame, she said, just loud enough for the people nearest us to hear clearly. We even missed that funeral for family, and this is the thanks we get. She'd called it that again. Not in those exact same words this time, but close enough that everyone standing near her understood exactly which event she meant. And I watched a couple of faces in the crowd flinch at the word trivial, hanging unspoken in the air behind what she'd actually said. The room turned to look at me. My mother stood near my father with her hands folded in front of her, looking entirely certain she already knew how the rest of this was going to go. I set down the paper plate I'd been holding, and I stood up. I want you to know I did not raise my voice, because that's the part of this that mattered most to me, more than anything else that happened that afternoon. 40 people were braced for a scene, and I gave them quiet instead. Quiet, in a room that loud, turned out to be the loudest thing there. Dad, I said, you're right that you gave me $40,000. Let's talk about that. But first, since Amber brought it up, let's talk about the funeral. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the first folded sheet of paper, laying it flat on a workbench next to a tray of sheet cakes somebody had brought for the occasion. It was a printed timeline, plain dates lined up against each other, nothing dressed up about it. This is the date Rachel and Hannah were buried, I said, pointing, and this, I moved my finger an inch to the right, is the date on the photo Mom posted from the cruise ship. 1 day later. Ketchikan Glacier Excursion, the caption said. Best trip in years. I looked up at the room. You didn't miss the funeral for family. You missed your own granddaughter's funeral for a cruise. And then you came home 5 days later and asked the grieving father to write you a check. The room had gone completely still, the kind of stillness you can actually feel pressing against your ears. My father's mouth opened and then shut again without a single word coming out of it. My mother's certainty drained visibly out of her face, like water pulled out of a sink, fast, all at once. Kevin, standing near the front counter, did what people who've just been cornered by an inconvenient truth often do. He exploded. "You're twisting this," he said, coming forward, his voice climbing louder with every step. "The shop is going under, Michael. I've got 2 kids and a mortgage, and you're standing here with a spreadsheet instead of helping your own brother when he needs you the most." I let him finish. I let every word of it land in that room without interrupting, because I understood, even in the moment, that people watching this needed to hear the whole of what he actually believed before they heard what I had to say back to it. When he finally ran out of breath, I reached into my jacket one more time and pulled out the second sheet of paper. A copy of the gift letter our parents had signed 4 years earlier at the title company, the document Rachel's and my mortgage lender had required before approving our loan, stating plainly, in both our parents' own signatures, that the $40,000 was a gift, not a loan, with no expectation of repayment in any form whatsoever. "You both signed this," I said, laying it down next to the timeline where anyone standing close enough could read it for themselves. "At the title company, 4 years ago, in front of a notary. It says, in your own handwriting, that this was a gift. So a bill demanding repayment doesn't hold up, Dad. You can ask me for help, the way anybody in a family can ask anybody else. You can't invoice me for a gift you swore, in writing, under oath, wasn't one." Nobody spoke. Then a folding chair scraped somewhere near the back of the shop, and Vivian Ross, Rachel's friend from the hospital, who'd driven up that morning to support me without me even having to ask her to, stood up. "I was at that funeral," she said, clear enough for the whole crowd to hear. "Everything he just said is true. I have the photos on my own phone from the day after, when Linda posted them from the ship. I saved them, because I couldn't quite believe it either." After Vivian spoke, the room turned the way a fully loaded truck turns on a wet road, slow at first, and then all at once. An aunt of mine I'd barely spoken to in years reached over and quietly slid the gift letter closer to herself so she could read the exact wording. A cousin who'd come mostly for the free food was suddenly reading a legal document over her shoulder. People who had walked into that reopening ready to see the cold, ungrateful son everyone had apparently been told about were now looking at 2 pieces of paper and a room gone silent, and doing the only honest thing left available to them, which was looking ashamed of what they'd been ready to believe about me 20 minutes earlier. My mother said my name once. "Michael." Like a question. Like some part of her genuinely still believed there was a version of this where I folded the papers back into my jacket and we all just had cake together and pretended the last 3 months hadn't happened. There wasn't a version of that. Not anymore. Kevin stood there near the counter, fists open now, all the anger drained out of him as fast as it had come. And for one long second I saw the thing sitting underneath all of it. He was terrified. He was genuinely going to lose the shop, and maybe the house that was tied to its loan, and his own 2 kids were going to feel that loss the way kids always feel these things eventually, whether or not anyone ever sits them down and explains it properly. "Michael," he said, quiet for the first time that entire afternoon. "I'm scared." I believed him. That was the closest thing to honest that anyone in my family had offered me in 3 full months. I felt the old reflex twitch in me, the one that had watched out for my little brother since he was small enough to ride on my shoulders at the county fair every summer. The one that used to walk him home from school when bigger kids gave him trouble. But he still hadn't said Rachel's name. He still hadn't said Hannah's. He was scared for himself the entire time, in every conversation we'd had for 3 months straight. Not once sorry for me. I folded my 2 pieces of paper back into my jacket. "I hope you figure it out, Kevin," I said. "I really do. But you're going to have to figure it out without me this time." Then I walked out onto the dock, and the air off the river was cool and clean and smelled like low tide, and for the first time in 3 months, I could actually breathe all the way down into my chest. Venus Marine Repair closed for good the following spring, a little less than a year after that reopening event. I heard about it secondhand, the way I hear about most things involving my family now, from a cousin who still checks in on me every couple of months out of what I think is genuine kindness rather than obligation. I felt considerably less about the shop closing than I expected to feel, which is to say I felt almost nothing at all. And I've stopped feeling guilty about that particular kind of nothing. I went no contact with my parents that Labor Day weekend and never looked back. There was no dramatic letter, no final blow-up phone call, No clean cinematic ending where I said one perfect sentence and walked away forever. I simply stopped answering, over and over quietly, and after a while, they stopped calling. And the silence that moved in behind that quiet turned out to be the most peaceful thing I'd felt in over a year. I kept the people who actually showed up for me. Uncle Carl comes for dinner most Sundays now, and we don't talk about my father much, and that's exactly how both of us seem to want it. Vivian and I still talk most weeks, mostly about Rachel, which is precisely how I want that too. I get to say her name out loud to somebody who actually knew her, and it doesn't feel like a burden to either of us. My crew at Station 2 never once treated me differently after that whole summer played out, except that somebody on shift, I still genuinely don't know which one of them did it, and at this point I've stopped trying too hard to find out, painted a small yellow sun, no bigger than a silver dollar, on the inside of Engine 2's cab door, right where I'd see it every single shift, without a word of explanation from anybody. I rebuilt on the same lot on Alameda Avenue. Smaller this time. Wired properly this time. Inspected twice over by a friend from a neighboring department who wouldn't take a dime for the extra trouble. I kept one thing from the old house that survived the fire almost completely untouched, tucked into a fireproof box in my new garage, one of Hannah's drawings, a yellow sun with far too many rays sticking out of it, the kind only a 6-year-old ever draws, the kind I will keep, unashamed, for the rest of my life. Almost a year to the day after the fire, I drove out to the cemetery at dawn with a fistful of wildflowers I'd picked up off Highway 101 on the way, the kind that grow wild along that stretch of coast every summer, whether anyone plants them or not. The grass was still wet, the fog still sitting low over the headstones the way it does most mornings out here, and I stood there for a long while, not saying much of anything out loud. Just being present with the two of them in the only way I've got left. My phone buzzed once in my coat pocket while I stood there. I looked at the screen. It wasn't anyone I needed to hear from anymore, and for the first time since the fire, that fact didn't hurt at all. I let it ring out into the wet grass, the same way I once let a different call ring out at a different cemetery, in a different summer, before any of this had a name yet. Family, I've come to understand over this last year, isn't the people who happen to share your last name. It's the people who show up when there's nothing at all in it for them, and it's worth remembering, clearly and without sentiment, the ones who only ever showed up when there was. That's the whole of what this year taught me. A funeral they called trivial, a cruise they wouldn't cancel for it, and a gift they tried, 5 days later, to turn into a debt I never signed for, and never will. If you liked this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more family-centered accounts like this.